My name is Massimo Fagioli. I am an associate professor in the theology department here at St. Thomas, and I have the honor to be the director of this new institute. The Institute for Catholicism and Citizenship is an enterprise of the Department of Theology and of the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of St. Thomas, with the intent to engage Catholic intellectual tradition, and particularly Catholic social thought, to inform and shape faithful responses to economic, social, and political issues alive in the public square. Inspired by Vatican II, the Institute promotes civil discourse, faithful citizenship, and the common good by fostering theological insight and interdisciplinary inquiry into economic, political, and social issues. The Francis effect was one of the reasons that moved our department, beginning in the fall of 2013, to consider the idea of a new institute on campus, and this idea has become a reality thanks to the support of the president of the university, Dr. Julie Sullivan, of the dean of the College of Arts and Science, Dr. Terry Langen, and to the generosity of Harry McNeely. The Institute will contribute to the Catholic mission at the university with seminars and discussions, with the dissemination of scholarship, and with events open to the public like this one. And the annual lecture particularly wants to focus on a subject that we believe is uniquely relevant and urgent in a particular time. And that's why we are very happy to have here with us John Carr for the inaugural lecture of the Institute. John Carr doesn't need any introduction, but it's part of the liturgy of these events. A University of St. Thomas alumnus, is director of the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Carr is a long-time leader at the intersection of faith and public life in Washington. For more than 2 decades, he served as director of the U.S. Catholic Bishops' Department of Justice, Peace, and Human Development. In that role, Carr assisted the bishops in sharing, applying, and advocating Catholic social teaching on a broad range of national and international issues. He helped build the Catholic community capacity to defend human life and dignity and to pursue justice and peace. He staffed the bishops in developing several statements, including Communities of Salt and Light, Everyday Christianity, and Faithful Citizenship. He represented the U.S. Bishops' Conference at the Vatican and in the Middle East, in Central America, Southern Africa, Southeast Asia, and Russia. He was the original convener of the Circle of Protection, an ecumenical coalition defending the poor and vulnerable in debates over U.S. budget priorities. Outside the Catholic Church, John Carr served as executive director of the White House Conference on Families under President Jimmy Carter, and as director of the National Committee for Full Employment, a civil rights labor religious coalition led by Coretta Scott King. Carr retired from the USCCB in 2012 to accept a residential fellowship on religion and politics at the Institute of Politics of Harvard University, and is the founder and director of the new Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life at Georgetown, which is a unique effort to share the wisdom of Catholic social thought more deeply and broadly, and to help educate and encourage a new generation of Catholic lay leaders in carrying out their vocation to be salt, light, and leaven in public life. He serves currently on the board of the Bread for the World and on the law school of the University of St. Thomas. He received the Vision Award on Catholic Charities USA, the John Ryan Award from St. Thomas, the George Higgins Award from the Archdiocese of Washington, and was named a Hunger Hero by Bread for the World. For the inaugural lecture, John Carr chose as titled Pope Francis, Faithful Citizenship in a Time of Polarization. Very kindly, John agreed to take questions at the end of the lecture. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming John Carr.
Thank you, Massimo. Let's begin with two images. 55 years ago, Dr. Norman Vincent Peale, Billy Graham, Dr. Martin Luther King Sr., and many other Americans said publicly that John F. Kennedy should not be our president, be elected president, because he would take advice from the Pope. Next September 23rd, the Congress of the United States will gather to take advice from the Pope. The only thing Democrats and Republicans in Washington agree on is they need advice from the Pope. It's a different world for faithful citizenship. I am honored to be a part of this inaugural lecture. I am very excited about this new institute on Catholicism and citizenship. In my mind, it is the right topic at the right time, in the right place, with the right leader. Massimo is a distinguished scholar. I've come to know him as a widely sought pundit on all matters papal. With some chagrin, I realized that I'm a columnist in America, and I took great ownership of things I had nothing to do with, like the interview of the Holy Father in America Magazine. And so I was sharing my wisdom about what it all meant, only to find out that Massimo and his wife translated the interview and might be a better source of wisdom. But you are blessed to have him in this role. And I think this is an example of how St. Thomas, with its many resources, this new initiative, Catholic Studies, its large and talented theology faculty, a seminary, a law school, and many other institutions, can make an even greater contribution to the common good in this region and in our country. I'm happy to be here for another reason. This really is home for me in a lot of ways. My dad is an alumnus of St. Thomas. My daughter is an alumnus of St. Thomas. My son-in-law is a student for an advanced degree in counseling and psychology. Be fair to say that my daughter was a better scholar than my dad and myself. One of the happiest days of our life, we growing up in Hopkins, was the day that my younger brother Jim found my dad's report card from St. Thomas and discovered he had gotten a D- in family life. 46 years ago, hard to believe, you could go to college at 5. I was one of the freshman class who moved into Loris Hall in the first year of St. John Vianney Seminary. Back then, I have colleagues here, Pete Perilla and Steve Marincel, there might be others. It'd be fair to say we were more interested in stopping the Vietnam War and figuring out Vatican II than studying logic or biology. But those years gave us, and particularly myself, direction, meaning, and a framework that I have used for the rest of my life in my work. Then Monsignor, then Archbishop Roach was the rector of St. John Vianney Seminary, and I can remember, there are many stories, but one I remember is we were gathered one night, and I was complaining. Archbishop Roach, then Monsignor Roach, thought I complained a lot, which was probably true. And I said, you wait. These new bishops that are going to be appointed are just going to be terrible, just awful. And Monsignor Roach said, John, here you go again. You don't know. You could like the new bishops. That was Monday night. On Tuesday morning, I was driving to my part-time job at City Hall in Minneapolis, and I heard that John Roach had been named the auxiliary bishop of Washington. And I called him, and I said, I told you they'd be terrible. Now, Archbishop Roach felt that one of his least appreciated achievements was making sure that I was not a priest of the Archdiocese of St. Paul. And actually, Father Deese had some role in that. He was my spiritual director and has a lot to answer for. Beyond that particular failing, he has been a stunning friend and mentor and leader, close to our family in so many times, but most impressively, the leadership he has provided for this place. There are ways I don't recognize it, but I still see the roots that led to its founding. And Father Deese was a remarkable leader in expanding its reach and deepening its impact, but always consistent with that mission. And now President Sullivan continues that mission in new ways, with new energy. I got to know her first out in California, where I saw her passion for Catholic social thought. But it gives me great pride to know that the institution that I was a part of and our family continues to be a part of has been so ably led and is now led again by remarkable leaders. And that this mission, which is needed so much for our church and for our society, will continue. Father Larry Snyder, you know him as your new vice president for mission. I know him as one of the most persistent voices for the poor and vulnerable in Washington. You are awfully lucky to have him in this new role. So there are lots of reasons to be here. I grew up in this church. I was shaped by this community. It is great to come home. But I am a little anxious. My academic credentials are somewhat underwhelming. Before I went to Georgetown to start this new institute, my participation in Jesuit higher education was paying for it. In my experience, the way the Jesuits practice the option for the poor is by making me poor. I did have a fellowship at Harvard. I was very excited about that. When I told our children that we would be visiting Cambridge for a semester, my son Tim said, "Are we talking the real Harvard?" It turns out, I didn't know what a fellow did. It turns out a fellow eats and talks. And I was qualified to be a fellow. I was really good at it. The other reason I'm anxious is I don't bring the distinguished credentials of Massimo. And I'm not a resident or a leader in the Twin Cities or Minnesota. In some ways, my situation reminds me of an outsider at an important parish event who thought he had delivered the right message as the guest preacher. And he and the pastor stood in the back as Mass was over and people greeted them. Most were kind, complimentary. But at the very end of the line, a gentleman came up and said, "You talk way too fast. You really had very little to say, and it wasn't very helpful." Well, obviously this concerned the preacher, and he turned to the pastor and he said, "Who is this guy, and what is his problem?" And the pastor said, "Don't worry about him. He just goes around repeating what everybody else is saying." So I know I will talk too fast. I hope I have something to say, and I hope it might even be helpful, but I'm not standing in the back with Massimo when this is over. I do bring some perspectives. My work with the Bishops' Conference for 25 years, I hope it counts off purgatory. It was a great place to see the strength and vitality of our church's social mission, not only in this place, around the world. but I had the most pompous title in Washington. How would you like to be Director of Justice, Peace, and Human Development for the U.S. Catholic Bishops' Conference? I was once introduced to a couple in the elevator, and the woman, having heard that I was in charge of justice, peace, and human development, said, "You need to do a better job." I've talked a little bit about my academic credentials. I'm very proud of my St. Thomas degree, and I wish others were as proud as I was. The other perspective I think I bring that's worth sharing, given the topic, is political. I'm a product of a mixed marriage. Both my parents are Minnesota Catholics. My mother grew up less than a mile from here. My dad over the river in Minneapolis. Her family, absolutely committed Republicans. Her brother, my uncle, some of you know, Joe O'Neill, was a Republican leader in the Minnesota Senate. My dad's father, my grandfather, was Hubert Humphrey's finance chairman when he first ran for mayor of Minneapolis. For the younger people in the audience, Hubert Humphrey was vice president of the United States in Minnesota. But I learned at an early age that we can express our values and act on our faith in different ways. Here's what I'm going to try and do in the next 45 minutes. What is our mission in terms of faithful citizenship? What is the context? And I would suggest our context is one of polarization. What does it mean to have Francis as Pope? What is the Francis factor? What is and what is not faithful citizenship? And then, if time permits, some directions and dangers for these times. It's very important to be clear what brings us together. It's not politics, not ideology. We are not the Democratic Party at prayer. We are not the religious caucus of the Republican Party. In public life, the Catholic community is a community of faith, not a lobby. We're advocates of life and dignity and justice, not just another interest group. We're the people of God, not a pack. How many here have worked on a mission statement for something? Miserable, right? Just awful. You know, you try and get every word right, and then no one pays any attention ever again. Well, I think the new institute has a wonderful mission. You heard it from Massimo. To promote civil discourse, faithful citizenship, and the common good by fostering theological insight and interdisciplinary inquiry into economic, social, and political issues. Well done. It is not, however, the best mission statement I've ever read. The best mission statement I ever read are those familiar words from Jesus as he quoted Isaiah in his inaugural presentation as he began his public life in that synagogue in Nazareth. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He has sent me to bring good news to the poor, liberty to captives, new sight to the blind, and to set the downtrodden free. That was Jesus' mission on earth, and I think that is our task today. He said, "You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its flavor, it should be thrown away. You are the light of the world. Don't put it under a bushel basket. Let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven." So this mission is not new. It is anchored in the Word of God, the Scriptures for us. We did not learn from Al Gore or Earth Day the call to care for creation. We learned it in Genesis, where we learned the earth is the Lord's. It is as old and passionate as the Hebrew prophets. The Old Testament calling us to choose life, to defend the poor, and it is as clear as Matthew 25, who says we will be judged on our response to the least of these. So the good news is, I think, that this mission is clear and visible. I think it is the vision of what we now call St. John the 23rd in the Vatican Council. It is the legacy of now St. John Paul II, who stood up for solidarity around the world. It is the teaching of Benedict XVI, who insisted charity and justice are at the heart of the church's life. And it is reflected now most clearly in the simple ways and powerful words of Pope Francis. The bad news is, too many times that tradition is not known. We call it our best kept secret. Or it's vague. Can't we all get along? Do good, avoid evil. Perhaps the most countercultural thing our church teaches us is that politics is a good thing. Our bishops have said in the Catholic tradition, responsible citizenship is a virtue and participation in the political process is a moral obligation. We can't sit on the sidelines wringing our hands. Now, this kind of talk makes people nervous. They insist it's a danger to faith and to politics. I would suggest we have the same rights, no more, no less, than any other citizens, any other group in society. We should expect neither favoritism nor discrimination in the exercise of our rights as citizens, voters. And I would believe that when we bring our deepest convictions about life and death, about war and peace, about who moves ahead and who gets left behind into public life, we enrich politics. We don't diminish or threaten it. If politics is not about the fundamentals, then it's just about money and power and ego. Because talk of religion and politics makes many people nervous, in some cases for very good reason, I want to try and share what I think it is not about. The religious practices, it is not about the religious practices of politicians. It's not about whether our candidates have been born again or sing in the choir, what church they go to, whether the president is a Muslim, he is not. I remember that Ronald Reagan talked all the time about God and never went to church. Bill Clinton went to church every Sunday and seemed to have missed a couple of the commandments. So it's not about who they claim to be. It is not about the political clout of religious groups. It's not about the Catholic vote. Anyone who talks about the Catholic vote, I don't think knows many Catholics. They certainly don't know my mother and my father. And it's not about our pastors or bishops telling us how to vote, which is not only ecclesially divisive and theologically unwise, it also happens to be illegal. So if it is not those things, what is it? This is what Pope Benedict said. It is not the church's responsibility to make this teaching prevail in political life. Rather, the church wishes to help form consciences and to stimulate greater insight into the requirements of justice, as well as readiness to act, even when this might involve conflict with situations of personal interest. So the church's role is to form consciences so we might understand more clearly our responsibilities, even when those conflict with our own personal interests. Our bishops have said we need a new kind of politics which is focused more on moral principles than the latest polls, more on the needs of the weak than on the benefits for the strong, and more on the pursuit of the common good than the demands of narrow interests. Jim Wallace, the evangelical teacher, preacher, writer, puts it another way. He says when so many of our leaders, and frankly a lot of our people, have their finger to the wind, we need to change the wind in public life. So where do you go to change the wind? Where do you go to find that new kind of politics? Well, I think you go to institutions. You go to institutions like our church, institutions like this university, institutions that are at the heart of Catholic life and civil society in our nation. Now, the church does not bring the typical assets to public life. The church does not offer endorsements or contributions or junkets. Uh, you probably heard this story, but it's an apocryphal story. The cheese manufacturers of Wisconsin, when you're from Minnesota, you always make fun of cheese things in Wisconsin. They're very worried that the consumption of domestic cheese has gone down dramatically. And they hire one of these big Washington consultants to turn this around. And he comes up with a really different idea. He says, we're not going to Washington. We're going to Rome. We're going to talk to the Holy Father. And somehow, this Pope meets with almost anybody. They get an audience with the Pope. And they make the case, and they say, Holy Father, we work very hard. Our cheese is wonderful cheese, but people aren't buying it. We have one request. You know that part in that prayer when it says, give us this day our daily bread? If you would only add 2 words, and cheese, we could be very helpful to you in your mission. And one of the cardinals says, oh, we could never do that. These are the Lord's words. It's the Lord's Prayer. And the cheese producers say, we'll give you double what the bread people gave you. Well, that is not what we bring. We bring a set of ideas, a moral framework, a set of principles. The scriptures say without a vision, the people perish. Well, we have a tremendous vision. However, it does not fit the categories of right and left, Democrat or Republican. It is both clear and complex. With all due respect to our evangelical sisters and brothers, this is a lot more complicated than what would Jesus do. Over the last century or so, the papacy has dealt with issues of public life, economic life, social life, more than any other topic. I want to assure you, going to go through each of these. But when you put it all together, I would suggest that the most important word in Catholic social teaching is the word and, A-N-D. Think about it. Human life and dignity, when people try and tear those things apart. Human rights and responsibilities, when people seem to advocate one or the other. Family and community. The priority for the poor and the vulnerable. The dignity of work and the rights of workers. Solidarity and subsidiarity. Care for the planet and for the poorest people on the planet. And the common good, which is all those ands put together. So we have a set of ideas. We have other assets. We have our experience as a community. Think about it. Who feeds the hungry? Who shelters the homeless? Who educates the young? Who cares for the sick? Who welcomes immigrants? The religious community, the Catholic community, are the largest non-governmental providers of education, healthcare, and human services in our nation. So it's not just what we believe that matters, it's what we do. We have a presence, we have institutions, 700 hospitals, hundreds of colleges and universities, almost 20,000 parishes. An organizer friend of mine said, you Catholics are terrific. You divide up the world and you call it yours. We're everywhere. And then we have our most underdeveloped asset, our people. In political terms, our constituency. It's true, without a people, without a vision, the people perish. It's also true, without a people, the vision is invisible. So others would have this more clear. I think there are about 65 million Catholics in the country. About a third of us go to Mass on any given weekend. That's a problem. We ought to talk about that. That leaves about 20 million people every weekend spending an hour together trying to figure out how they can be better people and worship their God. What would NBC News give for that? What would MoveOn.org give for that? And we have leaders. And I'm going to spend in a moment talk about our particular leader of this moment, Pope Francis. Now, I think we take on that mission, we deploy those assets in a particular context. Part of it is economic, the great gaps between the rich and the poor. Part is cultural. I think we are developing a culture of violence with 1 million abortions a year, advocacy of euthanasia, debating whether we ought to use the death penalty in Boston today. But for purposes of our discussion of faithful citizenship, I think polarization is the most significant part of our context. Some of that polarization is inside the church, ecclesial. Some of it is economic, different classes. Much of it is racial and ethnic, as we've sadly experienced over these last few months. Some of it is cultural, how we see the world and the institutions within our society. And there's a lot of ideological polarization, liberal versus conservative, and certainly partisan political differences. I think that polarization is reflected most clearly in Washington in what I would call a demoralized politics. And I mean that in two senses of the word. It is demoralized in the sense they can't seem to get anything else done. They're patting themselves on the back that they confirmed an attorney general months and months and months after she was nominated. Did something on human trafficking after they were paralyzed for weeks. It is demoralized in the sense that in some ways they have lost their way, focus more on personal or partisan advantage. Our society should be protecting the weak. Our politics should be safeguarding the most vulnerable. Instead, it serves the most powerful. And we can go through why that is. Some of it's political, some of it is campaign financing, some of it is the way we draw our boundaries. It is, I think, the result of too much of two kinds of individualism. Among some Republicans, it is the market that is the measure of everything. And so you have kind of an economic individualism. Among some Democrats, choice is the ultimate criteria for every political issue, what I call lifestyle individualism. So you end up with a libertarianism of both the left and the right, which frankly does not leave much room for the least of these or the common good. Now, it is very hard to break out of that polarization. You pay a heavy price if you break ranks. Governor Bush said immigration can be an act of love and took enormous heat. Yesterday, 3 Democrats voted not to support federal funding of abortion, and they will take a lot of heat for that. Some of it is money. If you break ranks, will the Koch brothers support you? If you have any reservations about abortion on demand, forget about support from Emily's list. And frankly, it's not just rich campaign contributors that divide us. A lot of the division comes from us, the voters. Increasingly, sociologists tell us our sharpest differences are political and ideological. We don't want to be friends with people who think differently than we do. We certainly don't want to marry them. My parents would wonder about that. Now, in that polarization, I think there is actually an opportunity for us. In tough times, I think there is genuine concern that our most fundamental problems are not just political or economic or technical. They are ethical, they are moral, and sometimes they're even spiritual. And so you can have a renewed focus on religion and faith. The Pew Foundation has invested great resources in studying these matters. If you're interested in that, go to their website. This new initiative at Georgetown and this new institute here at St. Thomas are examples, I think, of an appropriate focus on religion and politics and how it can advance the common good. The bad news is it can be misused. I find the religious right more right than religious. Where are their voices on the least of these, or the death penalty? And we all know politically correct Christians who will defend the eggs of endangered species, but not the lives of unborn children. Some of this can be simplistic or shrill. The Godometer was something Time magazine invented to measure the God talk in political campaigns. I think often what we have are politicians practicing theology without a license and religious leaders practicing partisan politics without a mandate, which leaves us in a mess, both church and state. I think there is a very surprising moment in terms of our political context. E.J. Dionne and I have had a running fight. Which institution is in more trouble, the Roman Catholic Church or American politics? And I said to him a while ago, who would have thought at this moment that Washington would be the place of stalemate, partisanship, and dysfunction, and Pope Francis would have made the Roman Catholic Church a place of hope and change? It's not the way we thought it would be. Now, Catholics play a particular role in American politics. They are crucial. There are a lot of us. We make up a quarter of the electorate. We are decisive. In 10 out of the last 11 presidential elections, Catholics voted for the winning candidate. Catholics are diverse. We differ by race, ethnicity, economics, and particularly by how often we go to church, how attached we are to our faith. And we are divided. We are not monolithic. E.J. Dionne, who I quoted earlier, said, "There is no Catholic vote, and it is really important." So think of it this way. You have about 40% of Catholics who tip to the Republican side, 40% of Catholics who tip to the Democratic side, and 20% who decide who's going to be president. So you end up with these kind of competing voices in the Catholic community. They seem to have the same designer, however. Think of the images of Catholics in public life. When Pope Francis appears in the well of the House, Senator Biden will be on one side and Speaker Boehner will be on the other side, two lifelong Catholics. Who stands up when? Think about the Supreme Court. 5 of the 9 justices are Catholic. Roberts, Scalia, Thomas, Alito, Kennedy, Sotomayor. In the House, Representatives Pelosi and Ryan, 136 members of the House are Catholic. In the Senate, you have a wide range. Barbara Mikulski is my senator. Robert Casey is a pro-life Democrat. Marco Rubio. 28% of the Senate, 25% basically, is Catholic. Think of governors. Jerry Brown, Jesuit educated. Sam Brownback, conservative. Governor Cuomo in New York. Governor Christie in New Jersey. Think of people running for president. Jeb Bush, a convert. Rick Santorum, who thinks some of us ought to convert, I think. Bobby Jindal, Martin O'Malley. Think of a church which includes the nuns on the bus and Cardinal Burke. And if you don't believe it, turn on the television at 7 o'clock and you have Bill O'Reilly on Fox and Chris Matthews on MSNBC. There are divisions in our church. Here's a little data. If you look at, these are from the Pew studies, and they're very recent. Ideology, 36% conservative, 38% moderate, 18% liberal, 8% who don't like answering polls. Party affiliation, 23% are Republican, 10% lean Republican, for a total of about a third, 33% Democrat, 15% lean Democrat, almost half of Catholics lean, and 10% independent, and 9% who couldn't decide. One of the most substantial differences, and I think frequently overlooked when you analyze Catholic participation in public life, are the differences between Hispanic Catholics and the rest of us. 69% of Hispanic Catholics are Democrats or lean Democratic, 41% of Anglo Catholics. 53% of white Catholics are Republican or lean Republican, 26% of Hispanic Catholics. For those who lead the church in these areas, I think they have not appreciated how Hispanic Catholics and other Catholics view the world, view politics in different ways. This is an old chart, but it gives you some sense of the makeup of the Catholic electorate. About a third white moderate, about a quarter white conservative, about 10% white liberal, about 20% Hispanic, and 8% African American and others. So we do not fit. We are not a monolith. If you look, and I'm not going to go through all this, but if you look, two things are obvious. One is Catholics tend to vote for the winner as a whole, and that changes over time. If you look at the race between Obama and Romney in 2012, Catholics as a whole voted 50% for Obama, 48% Romney, almost exactly what the overall number was. But within that, Romney won almost 60% to 40% among white Catholics, and Obama won 4-1 among Hispanic Catholics. And those shifts, Obama lost Catholic votes from the previous time he ran. He particularly lost white Catholic votes, but he gained more Hispanic Catholic votes. One of the things that people who analyze this look at closely is religious participation. Catholics who attend weekly were more inclined to vote for the Republican nominee than the Democrat. Catholics who do not, more the other way around. One of the things I want to know, Pete Perilla taught sociology. How do we know that people tell the truth when they say they go to church every Sunday? I've been to church on Sundays, and a lot of them aren't there. If you look at this most recent congressional election and contrast it to the earlier ones, you see that Catholics are increasingly voting for Republican candidates for Congress. So part of the Catholic political reality is, first of all, a lot of Catholics don't participate at all. Many Catholics vote their party, their class, their ethnicity, their interests, their prejudices. And what we know, both from experience and from polling, is Catholics are open to the moral dimensions of issues, not who or how to vote. One of my favorite stories is Mrs. O'Reilly. She's from Chicago. She cares about her faith, her family, and the Democratic Party. And she is very concerned. Her son had not only moved to the suburbs, he had become a Republican. And they were arguing about politics one night, and the son said, "Mother, if Jesus Christ himself came back as a Republican, you wouldn't vote for him." And the mother turned to him and said, "Well, why would he change his party affiliation after all these years?" Well, that may be true for Mrs. O'Reilly, but it's not true for a lot of us. So in that context steps Francis. The first thing we ought to recall is what a surprise he was. A Jesuit from Latin America. I think he was 40th on the betting line. I went back to Harvard for a panel on the Pope. And it'd be fair to say Harvard doesn't have a lot of panels on popes. Pretty secular place. And I hope none of the academics in the room will be upset with me, but some of the panelists did what academics do, which is explain that they knew it all along. It was time for someone from the third world when he had finished second. And I said, wait a minute. When I left Harvard, if I had called a publisher and say, here is the outline for my book. First, the Pope resigns. says he can't do it anymore. Second chapter focuses on an old Jesuit on a bus in Argentina. Third chapter, the old Jesuit on a bus gets elected Pope, calls himself Francis. Fourth chapter, he refuses to move into the palace and spends Holy Thursday at a prison washing the feet of young Muslims and Christians, girls and boys. What do you think they would tell me to do with my book? The most polite thing they'd say is, don't waste your time. Well, it's quite a story. Can't wait to find out how it turns out. My favorite story, and it's not particularly relevant, but it symbolizes for me some of the appeal of Pope Francis. On the night he was elected, he retired to his same room in the guest house. And he comes out at 6 o'clock in the morning, and there standing at attention is one of the Swiss guards, with the spear and the pantaloons and the whole deal. And Pope Francis turns to him and says, "What are you doing?" And he says, "I'm protecting you." And the Pope says, "Well, when did you start protecting me?" And he said, "Last night at midnight." He says, "You've been standing there all night?" Yes. He goes into his room and he brings out a chair. And he says, "Have a seat." And the Swiss guard says, "I can't sit down, I'm on duty." And the Pope says, "Who says you can't sit down?" And he says, "My commandant." He says, "Maybe you haven't heard. I'm the Pope. Have a seat." He says, "Have you had anything to eat?" He says, "No." Goes into his room, comes out with a sandwich. He says, have something to eat. He says, I can't eat on duty. He said, "You're not listening. I'm the Pope. Bon appetit." You can tell a lot about a leader by how he treats the people around him who don't have power. Some of my friends said this is all symbolic. He hasn't changed anything. Symbols are substance in a sacramental church. What he wears, where he lives, how he talks, where he stands. One of my liberal friends said this is all one grand Vatican PR campaign. And I said, name the last successful Vatican PR campaign. I think it was pre-Crusades. A man, what other leader stands in front of an airplane and takes questions for 90 minutes? Searches out the handicapped, the poor, the vulnerable, the children. So what does he bring to this? Well, he brings a different set of priorities. One of the rules, as I understand it, you could tell me, Massimo, it's a mortal sin to say what happens in a conclave. So what does Pope Francis do? But on the day after he's elected, he calls a press conference and tells them what happened in the conclave. And he said, this is a direct quote, "When things were looking dangerous," meaning the votes had increased, his friend turned to him, hugged him, and said, "Don't forget about the poor." And he said, "That's when it came to me. Francis of Assisi. He's the man of poverty, the man of peace, the man who loves and protects creation." From the very first moment of his papacy, he chose his priorities. On politics, he said, quoting the Catholic bishops of the United States, "Responsible citizenship is a virtue, and participation in political life is a moral obligation." Frankly, bishops usually quote popes, not the other way around. None of us can say, "I have nothing to do with public life." No, I am responsible. I have to do my best by participating in politics. Politics is one of the highest forms of charity because it serves the common good. He asked, "God, give us more politicians capable of sincere and effective dialogue." Does that sound like Washington? It's a lofty vocation, seeks the common good. I beg the Lord to grant us more politicians who are genuinely disturbed by the state of society, the lives of the poor. Does that sound like the Senate Finance Committee? He uses this powerful image of a throwaway culture. He says, first we throw away the young, then the old, the unborn, the unwanted, immigrants, women who are trafficked, and then even God's creation. We must say no to this throwaway culture. So I think what Pope Francis brings to this question are a set of perspectives, a different way of looking at the world. He looks at everything from the bottom up, from the outside in, for how it affects the least of these, and then the rest of us, and then the most of us. He said, let's not be obsessed by particular issues involving sexual morality. Yet he doesn't retreat on the defense of the unborn and the vulnerable. He calls for encounter and engagement. He talks a lot about evil and the devil, but his response is one of joy and mercy. So I think in some ways we have the same teaching, but new urgency, new priorities, and a different example. So, wherever he goes, and when he comes to the United States, I think we will hear about human life and dignity. He said it is not progressive to solve problems by ending the life of the vulnerable. He says the measure of a society is how we treat the poorest among us. He warns us against the globalization of indifference. He begs the world not to turn away from Christians and other minorities being killed simply for their faith. He defends the family. He is passionate about migrants and immigrants. The first place he went was Lampedusa, the Isle of Tears. And he said, who cries for these mothers and fathers? He went to the Holy Land and invited leaders back to talk of dialogue and pursue peace. And this summer, probably at the end of June, he will go back to Genesis and claim his legacy as Francis and offer an encyclical on the moral obligation to care for creation. He says, laity, us, we're not just to be greeters or lectors or ministers of Holy Communion. I was an extraordinary minister. It was wonderful, but it's not my vocation. Rather, we are called to live and spread the faith in families, workplaces, schools, neighborhoods, and beyond. The layperson has to live as a layperson to be a leaven of the love of God in society, to create and sow hope, to proclaim the faith not from a pulpit, but from everyday life. Our vocation is in the world. This is the work of St. Thomas, to prepare people to be salt, light, leaven. He says, I believe that Catholics tasked with political life must keep the values of their religion before them, but with a mature conscience and competence to realize them. If you were to describe, in other words, the mission of this institute, of our initiative, of major parts of this university, Catholic Studies, the law school, the seminary, our task is to help people develop the mature conscience and the competence to apply our faith to big issues. Now, the church has tried to reflect this over the years, and I've been involved in that since 1976. This will be the first time that I've not been involved in that process. I sort of feel free. I can offer some advice now. And I was going to summarize the essence of that, but time is short, so I'll go right to my advice. I will tell you that the foundations of the document are conscience and prudence. We have a duty to resist evil, intrinsic evil, it says, and to pursue the good, the dignity of all, and that we should avoid two temptations. One is to make no distinctions among issues, and the other to say, as long as I'm clear on abortion, for example, nothing else matters. Our faith is an adult faith. It says when we vote, we should take into consideration a candidate's commitment, character, integrity. But in the end, this is a decision to be made by each Catholic, guided by a conscience formed by Catholic moral teaching. These, I think, are the challenges that our bishops face this time, and we face. One is, how do we put together the resistance to intrinsic evil, like the destruction of innocent human life, like racism, which frankly deserves more attention these days in light of the divisions in our country, and the requirement to pursue the common good and protect the poor and vulnerable. Pope John Paul II had a wonderful line: just because we say no does not mean we can avoid saying yes. So it's not just what we oppose, it's what we work for. I think it is very important on religious freedom that we put in perspective the church's fights in the courts to remain true to its convictions is important. It pales in comparison to people fighting for their lives to practice their faith. One of the problems, I think, with political life is the definition of the audience. Who here is not an everyday person, an everyday American? Protecting the middle class is a mantra in both parties. But really, isn't the test of politics how we protect the weak and the vulnerable? In the words of Matthew 25, the least of these. So we have these poll-tested formulations, everyday Americans fighting for the forgotten middle class. But our faith tells us that our soul is tested not by how we take care of the people in the middle or the top, but rather the people at the bottom. We have to recognize the diversity in our own community and speak to it, and we have to adopt the Pope's perspective of looking at politics, looking at economics from the bottom up, from the outside in. In some ways, I think the test is two kinds of leadership. One, if you think we've lost, if you think the culture is overwhelming us, then you hunker down and you preserve and you protect what you have. If you think we have what the world needs on life, on human dignity, on justice, on peace, then you engage and persuade. Pope Francis is an engage and persuade kind of leader. Mark Shields, the PBS pundit, puts it really well. He talks of political parties, but I really think it refers to our church. He says you can tell the health of an organization by whether it's looking for converts or heretics. Pope Francis is looking for converts. Our faith offers us different questions. We will hear sometime soon in the debates. Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago or 8 years ago? That's not our question. Are we better off? Are the unborn protected? Are immigrants defended? Are the poor lifted up? The dangers, righteousness. Righteousness in the Bible is a wonderful thing. Not the way I practice it. When I'm sure I'm right, I'm wagging my finger at people. We have to ask ourselves, does our faith shape our politics or does our politics shape our faith? We have to worry about polarization. Think about it. In our community, you have pro-life and social justice. You have Hispanic and Anglo. You have the liturgy people and the education people. Here on campus, you've got the sciences and the humanities. You've got Catholic studies and theology. You've got graduate studies, undergraduate. We can divide up the work, but we shouldn't divide up the community. We belong to each other. We are in this together. The worst danger is to say, you know what, I'm not an activist. I didn't sign up for this. It's not my job. I'm not into politics. No believer, and frankly, no leader at a university like this can say that bringing good news to the poor and liberty to captives, to being salt, light, and leaven is not my job. So let me conclude with some advice for these days of political tension. I think our church, our institutions are called to be political but not partisan. Political in the sense that important decisions are made every day about life and death and who moves ahead, who gets left behind, about war and peace. But we should not be chaplain for any party, cheerleader for any candidate, apologist for any administration. We need to be principled but not ideological. We should not compromise on our basic beliefs on human life and the priority for the poor and the obligations of solidarity. But we ought to work with people with lots of different views on how to apply those principles. We should be civil but not soft. We should stand up for what we believe, but we should not impugn the motives of others. Calling someone a baby killer or a war criminal is probably not the best way to engage or persuade. And we should be engaged but not used. When people come to St. Thomas, they should listen to our values, our priorities, as well as articulate theirs. We should not be part of anybody's photo op. We should be shaping the debate on our terms as best we can and trying to hold our politicians and candidates accountable. So when Pope Francis comes, it'll be quite a sight. But I think, unlike 55 years ago, when being Catholic was suspect, right now this is the moment to take our faith, to take our values, to take our experience into the public square and stand up for what we believe. This is the time for an institute on citizenship and Catholicism. And our message should be very much like the Pope. We must restore hope to the young, aid to the old, open ourselves to the future, spread love. We must be the poor among the poor. We must include the excluded and preach peace. Many of us will welcome Pope Francis to our land and wonder how we can participate in his visit. I would suggest to you the best way to welcome him, the best way to participate in his pilgrimage is to follow his example. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, for this. I'm really looking forward to that site of Pope Francis with John Boehner and Joe Biden. Uh, I was told we had two microphones. Yes.
I think they're back there.
Oh, great. Thanks, Lori. So we have time for questions. I invite John to stay here.
Any questions on doctrine, go to Father Deese.
So much for all your words. I was wondering if you could comment on the dynamics of religious freedom that have been so evident in the Indiana conversation and how just what that concept, it seems so opposite of everything that you've just said. And so if you could just comment on the relationship between religion and politics and religious freedom and respect and dignity and all of that.
Sometimes tough issues bring out the best in us, and sometimes they bring out the worst in us. I would suggest Indiana was the second. I think both sides, frankly, exaggerated and at times at least didn't tell the full truth. The issue here is whether religious institutions can carry out their work consistent with their values, and whether the state ought to be able to compel them to act against their teachings, and at what level. So the Religious Freedom Restoration Act says that the burden has to be substantial, and there can be no other way to meet the need that's being described. This takes on a particular context in the situation of same-sex marriage and gay rights, where religious freedom is posed against personal freedom. One of the challenges, I think, is to find a way to live with pluralism as we wrestle with tough issues. This is one I've dealt with in my own family and my own heart. There are people who are deeply convinced that marriage is between one man and one woman. Our faith says that. That is now, in some circles, labeled bigotry. That was the position of Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama 2 years ago. When did it become bigotry? One of the questions are, can we give each other the benefit of the doubt? Frankly, can the gay community win with graciousness? Can the religious community understand the feeling that in asserting their rights, they may be jeopardizing the rights of others? So this is one probably that shouldn't be fought out on the headlines and the front pages. Utah, of all places, reached a very different solution that I think is worth looking at, where the Catholic community, the Mormon Church, and the LGBT community sat down together and said, is there a way that we can oppose discrimination against LGBT people in a way that respects the rights of religious institutions? And through dialogue and the building of trust, they reached an accommodation that passed almost unanimously. I actually think dialogue is a better path on tough issues like this than fighting it out either in the media or with attack ads. So, tough issue, complicated issue. Let's try and figure out how to live with pluralism that respects the rights of others. It's not easy, but it's, I think, one of the most pressing issues facing our country. I have trouble hearing. Let me just add another thing, which is there is an egregious example of threats to religious freedom which is being ignored and neglected. There are people who believe what we believe, who get a knock on their door and are told, you either leave, you convert, or you die. That is wrong, no matter what religion we're talking about. And so while we're fighting some things out in the courts and the legislature, we ought to be standing up for the rights of everyone to believe what they believe. We ought to be in dialogue with the Jewish community, the Muslim community, and others to see how we can protect the rights of each other and not abuse our power and use violence. And to do so, frankly, with some humility. None of us have our hands clean in this area. So,
What I had asked is if you could also address the abortion dynamic in the religious freedom conversation.
the abortion dynamics. Well, let me give you an example. I work in the District of Columbia. Our city council has passed a law that says that you cannot discriminate in any way in employment or other ways on the basis of people's convictions or behaviors regarding what they call reproductive rights. So, theoretically, Planned Parenthood could be required to employ a militant right-to-lifer. Or the Right to Life Committee could be required to employ someone who believed the most important issue in the world is free access to abortion. Or the Catholic Church could be required in its human services to hire people who think that its teaching on marriage or its teaching on sexuality is fundamentally wrong, even in positions which require the teaching of that position. So I think my own view, and there are others that are much better, and many of them work at this university, when the government gets in the position of defining what is religion and what is not, that is a very bad place to be. So you have local government saying a church is okay, they can discriminate, but a charity could not decide that its director has to share its convictions about human life and dignity. This is another example, I think, where actually the work of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which was a broad coalition, included the ACLU, included the Jewish community, included the Catholic community, offered some wisdom. So, other way over here.
There was a student activity of the Pre-Law Society that dealt with the Indiana issue, actually
I'm
the
still
New Mexico case that had to do with the photographer. But Tom Berg in the law school and others are working on recommendations to legislatures that have a Religious Freedom Restoration Act that actually honors both those with their religious beliefs and those who are part of the gay community. Actual language for actual states. And it tries to set the example of imagining both parties having freedoms that could be abridged. It's a really good place to look, and the students actually pointed that out.
I had read that Francis.
Thanks for your comment. Anything else?
I,
Anyone want to talk about the poor? Hi,
I had
there.
read that Francis in Buenos Aires stayed out of the ideological debates between the military junta and the guerrillas out in the jungle. He just spent time out in the streets with the poor, and a theology of the poor is his attitude towards the development of the faith. How do you think that squares with his engaged approach to wider society and not turning inward as a church now? That message that you provide here, it seems like he's had a change from his younger life when he was just a pastor of the streets, basically.
Mm-hmm. Can you help me summarize it again?
His theology of the poor in Buenos Aires seems like it was a distancing himself from ideological debates of either side. He seems now much more engaged. Did he have a change during his priesthood that?
There are others that know him better. My impression is that he went through a variety of experiences. That famous America interview that Massimo helped translate talks about his experience in Argentina as a superior, Jesuit superior. He said, I was a terrible superior. I didn't listen. I was rigid, authoritarian. I divided the community, and I learned a lot from that. I need to listen. I think one of the best ways to understand Pope Francis is to understand Cardinal Bergoglio. When he had an afternoon free, he did not go to the opera. He went to the slums. And the world looks a little different from the slums of Buenos Aires than it does from Wall Street or a university in Virginia, in Germany, or in Warsaw, or frankly, the Twin Cities. And this is a person who tells all of us that we need to encounter the poor directly. One of the things he says is very directly, he says, people who say they don't have time to encounter the poor, and this frequently is the case with professional, academic, business, and ecclesial leaders, are wrong. No one is freed of the obligation of reaching out to those in need. And he says we should not experience their pain through a screen. that can be turned off. So one of the things I think people underestimate is his revolution is not a revolution of ideas. It's a revolution of encounter, of seeing the other as a sister and brother. And if we see it that way, then ideology and politics and distance begins to fade away. So I said earlier, I don't think we have particularly new teaching. I think we have new passion, new urgency, and new priority that comes from a man who looks at the church, looks at the world, looks at the economy from the bottom up.
Some years ago, John, I was able to live in Bolivia for several years. And I think it gives a perspective on Francis. I go into people's homes and I see a map of the world, and I thought it was upside down because on top was South America and below it was North America. I said, no, no, we're on top. No, when you're in space, it's just there. And I think what struck me over and over again is how oftentimes we as North Americans, as Americans, we perceive our issues, our concerns, our problems as being the agenda for the church and the world. And I think Francis is saying there's a global, there's a universal, there's a Catholic agenda that we have to get in sync with. I think that's a struggle we face even as Catholics in this country.
I think you've really put your finger on it. One of the most remarkable things about Pope Francis' visit to the United States, I think he is one of the few important leaders in the world who has never set foot in the United States. We were not on his screen for the longest time. So his world is not centered around us, and that will be uncomfortable for some of us. For others of us, it'll give us a whole new perspective. I think it'll be fascinating to see him in the well of the house. I think the people who are looking forward to this grand affirmation of their prejudices or partisan positions are likely to be bitter disappointed, whether they're on the Republican side or the Democratic side. And for members of Congress, for the rest of us, I think we ought to look forward to the Pope's vision, not for the ways he reconfirms us, but for the ways he challenges us. He calls us to think anew, to act anew. We have had these dialogues, much like tonight, although with more voices. And we had the fancy pundits and we had the superior intellects. And one of the people said, I like Pope Francis because he thinks and acts and talks like Jesus. He doesn't talk in abstract principles. He is a walking, talking parable. And in that way, I think he teaches us more effectively than any encyclical ever could.
What bothers me, especially with the emphasis on the election coming in 2016 and all the candidates, and listening to when they talk about their budget, and every budget that they individuals have cited is always reducing the food stamps and assistance to the poor, and that's in order to balance the budget. You know, that's the first thing that they contribute to. So I was just wondering on how we can, in some ways, try to get back. I don't know what word to use, but anyway, to try to impress upon them the need. And then they cite, one of the reasons they cite is the abuse that some individuals do with the handouts, or if you want to say handouts, or with what the entitlements. But you know, it's such a small percentage compared to the good that on the whole it used. And on the other hand, the politicians never say anything about corporate entitlements in any way, reducing help for the oil companies and the farm subsidies and stuff like that.
Two quick thoughts, one backwards, one forward. I was a part of something called the Circle of Protection, which was sort of the middle of the Christian community. Catholic bishops, Catholic charities. Larry was one of our leaders. Salvation Army, National Association of Evangelicals. And we said that we were going to try and protect in the budget process the people who had no voices, no power, no lobbyists. And we had a meeting with President Obama. And one of the people there was a bishop named Bishop Ricardo Ramirez, a wonderful man, who looked across the table at the president and said, I think you're a good man. I know you're a Christian, but there's something I don't understand. In my Bible, it says, whatsoever you do for the least of these, you do unto me. In Washington, it must say, whatsoever you do for the forgotten middle class, you do unto me. What about the priority for the poor? And the president looked at him and says, I think you've got us on that. And then there was a meeting with Representative Paul Ryan, and he talked about his budget and shared sacrifice and lots of things. And I raised my hand, and I said, Mr. Chairman, I am a white, 60-some church bureaucrat who makes a good living. I've looked at your budget, and I don't see anything, any sacrifice you're asking for me. My Social Security, my Medicare, my charitable deduction, my home mortgage deduction, it's all there. My daughter teaches in inner city Baltimore, and everything the federal government does is at risk there, whether it's nutrition assistance or job training or the rest. It doesn't feel like shared sacrifice. And Mr. Ryan said, well, when you're done with me, go see AARP, the senior lobby. He also said, I'd like to come after you. And it seemed a little personal. But so I said, so it's not shared sacrifice, it's power. And seniors have it, and poor people don't. Well, what happened is there was an agreement between President Obama, between Representative Ryan and Speaker Boehner, that the sequester, automatic budget cuts, would exclude food stamps, Medicaid, the earned income tax credit, the child tax credit, on the principle that when times are tough, you have to watch out for the weakest. Now looking forward, in 2 weeks, our initiative is going to join with others in bringing together leaders of the evangelical community from across the spectrum, leaders of the Catholic community from across the spectrum, and other leaders, religious and other allies, focused on three things. One is to end the silence on poverty and lack of opportunity. Two is to address the stalemate between those who focus on family issues and those who focus on economic issues, knowing that both leave people behind. And thirdly, we want to say that overcoming poverty and increasing opportunity needs to be a moral imperative and a national priority. And we think if you could get unity in the evangelical community, unity in the Catholic community, we could move this to the center of national discussion. A lot of people say, oh, we agree on the principle, it's just the specifics we disagree on. I don't think there is any evidence that we agree on the principle that the poor ought to come first, that overcoming poverty ought to be an urgent national priority. Let's agree on that principle, and then let's have a full-scale debate about the best ways to increase opportunity and reduce poverty. But we're not there yet. So you're right. The poor get hurt the most. Every once in a while, the churches stand up and we reduce the pain. But we need to move from defense to an affirmative agenda that say the measure of our society, and here I'm quoting Pope Francis, is how we treat people who have nothing more than their poverty. If that's his message when he comes, it'll be a powerful message, not only to our leaders, but to each of us as well.
Going off of what you just said and broadening out a little bit, a debate I have with a close friend of mine often is it government's role to take care of the poor, or is it charities, churches' role to take care of the poor? And that's a huge what's the role of government? But just in terms of taking care of the poor, does the Pope care who takes care of the poor? Should we care? Are we just having a debate that we don't need to have, and just whoever you think does it, you help contribute to them? And also I guess if one side says, well, if you give to the government, maybe people you don't necessarily think deserve your money get your money. If you make the choice and give to a charity, you get to decide, who gets that money. And but I guess again, from just the aspect of the poor, whose role is it?
Sure. A story and then an idea. My mother, I described as the conservative Republican. She started a pro-life pregnancy center in our community. That center could provide diapers. We could provide a crib. We could provide help and counsel. We could not provide health care for that baby and that mother. We could not provide enough nourishment for the future. We could not provide a future. So we ought to do what we can to comfort and care for that mother and child who are alone in the world. But we're part of a society that says nobody ought to go without health care. And frankly, none of us would want our health care to depend on your generosity. So there are some things that we do together, and government is the tool we use. One of the things I hope universities do is help us figure out how to do that better and better and better. One of the great things about being a Catholic is everything's really complicated. When I worked at the Bishops' Conference, I said we should have a sign out front that says, "Nuances are us." But if you think of poverty, think of it as a table with 4 legs. One leg is what individuals and families ought to do. Sacrifice for your kids. Stay in school. Don't have kids till you're ready to. Work. Find a job. Get the skills. A second leg of the table is what churches and community institutions, charities ought to do. We ought to support families in those choices. We ought to help them find a job. We ought to stand up against injustice. We ought to organize so jobs come to a community. A third leg of that table is the market. We need decent jobs at decent wages. People who can work should work, and they ought to be able to support a family. Work should not be another form of poverty. And the fourth leg of that is government, which acts when the other institutions fail, which protects us against injustice or discrimination, and which helps us to do really big things that we can only do together, like protect the nation or provide health care or build an interstate highway system. So the problem with Washington is everybody falls in love with one leg of the table. Some people are into individual responsibility. Some people say faith-based will do everything. Others say the market is the solution. And there are still a few others say government has the answer. That's not our way. Our way is to say that all those institutions need to work together, and our focus ought to be not on the politics, not on just the economics. It ought to be on the dignity of that person. We ought to see that person as a child of God. In fact, we ought to see that person as Christ, as Matthew 25 tells us. And if we tried to get those institutions working together, if we treated people with dignity, if we saw people in trouble as Christ, we would probably do a better job. And one of the things that I think we can do is change the priorities of public debate. As I said earlier, the question is not, are you better off than you were 4 or 8 years ago? Are we better off? Especially, are the poorest and most vulnerable amongst us better off? And I think that's the question that Pope Francis will raise when he comes.